Well, good morning. It's rainy and a little bit breezy here in Chesterbrook. I'm under one of the picnic pavilions here in Wilson Farm Park, a nice natural setting for episode 42 of Getting Back to Conversation. I'm a day late. It's September the 23rd. Usually I do this on Wednesdays, but I'm recording today on Thursday. In previous episodes, I mentioned to you a book that I came across. It's entitled High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. It's written by Amanda Ripley. And I have not finished the book yet. I finally got my copy and I started reading it, as I think I mentioned in the last episode a couple of weeks ago. But what I found so far is excellent. And this past weekend as I was reading, I came across a passage that really struck me. And so I want to share that with you to begin today's episode. Here's what she writes. On average, doctors interrupt patients after only 11 seconds of listening to them explain what ails them. 11 seconds. When doctors don't interrupt, patients stop talking on their own just 6 seconds later. Now think about that for a second. When doctors don't interrupt, patients stop talking on their own just 6 seconds later. Ripley goes on, that's all the time they need to explain themselves, that they being the patient. That's all the time they need to explain themselves, just 17 seconds, but almost none of them get it. I thought this seems a little odd, and I questioned it. So I looked it up and I found indeed that in a 2018 study in the Journal of General Internal Medicine that on average, patients get about 11 seconds to explain the reasons for the visit before they are interrupted by their doctor. So what are the consequences of this, being interrupted before you finish? Well, Ripley goes on to write, patients, if they feel understood, leave the hospital more satisfied and more likely to follow their doctor's orders. I got to thinking about the several doctors I've seen over the last year or so, and I'm glad to report that of the three and the four cases that I feel that I have been heard and understood by my doctor. However, there is one doctor that I feel neither hears or understands my symptoms or, if you will, my complaints. And to be honest with you, I feel frustrated and I feel a bit angry that I'm still dealing with some of the consequences of those symptoms. So much so that I made an appointment this coming month with that practice, and I now have a strategy in place. When I go, I am going to stay until I feel heard and understood. Well, I think what I feel, you feel. I think that we all want to be heard and understood. And so in today's episode, I want to chat for a few minutes about listening. Listening. And I've come up with a tentative list of reasons why people listen to their conversation partner, assuming that they do listen. So here's the first one. People listen to respond. So let's be honest. The reason we're listening to a friend, a neighbor, a coworker, somebody is because we are listening to respond. And that's not all bad. Imagine having a conversation with someone who sat listening to you and never responded, either verbally or non-verbally. That would be frustrating, right? And not really much of a conversation at all. Rather, it feels more like you are an actor or someone delivering a monologue and you are delivering it to an unresponsive audience. But listening to respond has a negative side. When you are listening to respond, you are like an actor who is looking for your cue. So, do I ask a question now? Do I share a story about a similar experience that I had? Do I offer a counter argument? The reality is that when you are listening to respond, you are listening and you're not fully listening. You're listening to take your next turn, to offer your thoughts in response to what the person said. So that's listening to respond. Second, there's listening to understand. Now, this is listening when the sole intent of this is to discern what the other person believes, thinks, or feels. Now, that may be rare, but I think that is a reason why some people listen to understand. This is not listening but just listening. This would be analogous to reading a book or a story or an article in a journal where your desire is to fully grasp the story or the argument that the author is putting forward. But that illustration points out the problem with merely listening to respond or to understand. The conversation is not complete. You may feel or believe that you have a very good comprehension of what your conversation partner is saying and what that means, but you can't be sure. And that is where the third kind of listening comes in. And that is listening to show your conversation partner that they've been heard. In High Conflict, Amanda Ripley introduces the reader to a lawyer by the name of Gary Friedman. We'll learn about Mr. Friedman more in episodes to come, but Friedman was a lawyer, typical lawyer, and he made his living off of conflict and adversarial relationships. No offense to lawyers, but I think any of them honestly would admit that that's where they live most of the time. But when two friends, a husband and wife, came to him, both asking him to represent them in their divorce, he first objected and said it couldn't be done, it wasn't legal, it wasn't right. But then he started to think differently and act differently. And he went on from being an advocate to one party in an adversarial proceeding to being a mediator between two friends who were going through a divorce. He worked to get this couple to not just talk at each other, but to talk to each other and hear each other so that they could work toward a meaningful and satisfactory resolution. And one of the techniques he and his co-author, Jack Himmelstein, write about in this act of being a mediator is the technique of looping. Looping, in Ripley's words, is to, quote, listen in ways that people see. When you engage in looping behavior, we show them that we're listening. We don't just tell them that we're listening. And one of the signature ingredients of looping is playing back what your conversation partner has said. Not in a mechanistic word-for-word manner, but you try to distill what your partner meant, and you attempt to use the most eloquent and thoughtful language you can muster. So, you rephrase or paraphrase what your conversation partner has said, and then you ask if you've gotten it right. That's important. And as no surprise, sometimes you get it right, and sometimes you don't. As a matter of fact, more often than not, that you get it wrong. And so you ask your partner, did I get it right? They respond, and you continue until she fully affirms your interpretation of what she has said. Ripley writes that something wonderful happens when you've reached that point. Their eyes light up and they say something like, exactly. This is the moment when your conversation partner feels that they have been heard and understood. And Ripley writes, it is amazing what happens when they feel that way. And now I'm quoting again from her book. When people do feel heard, magical things happen. They make more coherent and intriguing points. They acknowledge their own inconsistencies willingly. They become more flexible. Customers who feel heard by their financial advisors are more likely to trust them and pay for their services. Workers who feel understood, who feel heard, perform better and like their bosses more. And among couples, people who feel more understood by their partners can make use of conflict without doing damage. In other words, the conflict is healthy. It's not high conflict. So let me conclude by encouraging you to listen to your conversation partner better and listening until she or he feels heard and understood. I believe that if we listen that way, even to people we may disagree with, we can begin to repair the tears, the fissures that are all too common in our relationships and in our society. And we can move forward toward good and productive conversations. Well, I've gone over again. I'd love to hear your comments or your questions. Put them in the section below in the comments. And I will post this video on YouTube as soon as possible. Well, I hope whether it's raining or sunny where you are, that you have a good day. And I hope that you have good, productive, meaningful conversations and that you feel heard and understood. Have a great day.